Good evening. Hi, my name is Philip Jones. I'm the Dean of the College of Security Intelligence. I think I know most of you know me, but I do want to welcome people from the community this evening and to hear this talk about the United States and China. Our speaker today, well, we'll do a couple of things. Number one, there are more books, and so we'll get back to that after the talk, okay? The donation is for the Prescott Police Foundation. And it's always tough to raise money for foundations, so please be generous, if you will. The second thing is there will be questions after the talk, and if you want to ask a question, come on down, line up behind the microphones, okay? Make that simple and easy. Our speaker tonight is Peter Krassel, sorry. He's going to speak the challenge of China versus the United States. Mr. DeCastle has his law degree from Hastings Law School in California, San Francisco. He has spent many years, 15 years, living in Hong Kong. He works in finance, he works in banking, and he has some different ideas about the world, okay? I thought it would be interesting to hear his views, which do not really run in conventional channels. So, of course, I'll have to say that his views are his own, not those of the college. I'm sure we'll find them interesting and have some food for thought. With that, I'd like to welcome Peter D. Krassel. Let's give him a good hand, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. It's an interesting time to be here at the beginning of a very, very interesting and different election in America, because the primary issues are really security when it comes to foreign relations, and one of the things I question is the intelligence of the voting public, not only in America, but worldwide. And I find it very interesting to be here speaking at this university and at the gracious invitation of Dr. Jones. The election, as we have heard and seen, starting with the primary, or the caucuses, I should say, in Iowa and going into the primary in New Hampshire, there are a few lessons to be learned when it comes to security and intelligence. The number one target and country that is repeatedly bashed in political campaigns is China. Whether you think it's right or wrong, I am of the opinion that it is wrong. In China and Hong Kong, where I spend a lot of time, you see some political bashing of America, which is also wrong. So how do we, as a people, because the reason I have the title, The Maids, Custom-Made Books, is I think we the people, whether it's the people in America or the people in China, are maids, because we're constantly asked to clean up the mess career politicians make, regardless of what country they're in, and then we're asked to pay for the privilege in the form of higher taxes or other hidden costs. Now, as someone who lives in Asia, where maids are very cheap, I still haven't found a maid that'll pay me for the privilege of cleaning up my mess. So why do we, the people, constantly agree to clean up the mess, especially when it comes to foreign policy and U.S.-China relations? It is very important to understand the history of empires, to understand the clash of the Chinese and American empires today. Because if we don't learn from the lessons of history, we shall repeat them. Now go back and look at any empire going back to the Greeks, the Parthenon in Greece, the pyramids in Egypt, the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, the American Empire, the Chinese Empire. Now, many don't see America as having been an empire, and many don't see China as having been an empire. But it is important to remember that China was a very illustrious and civilized empire for several thousand years, while, as the Chinese like to remind me, Europeans still lived in caves, and America did not exist as a country as we know it today. And all those empires of the past are now gone and failed. And it is very important when it comes to security and intelligence to make sure that the American empire does not fail, and at the same time, it works with another empire and civilization as partners. Because the world today in the 21st century, as we move forward, is one that there cannot be one hegemon, whether it's America or China. And it is important to understand who is creating the friction in the relationship. And if we go back and look at the recent history of China and America relations, and what I mean by recent history, just World War II, when America was bombed at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, and the Chinese and Americans worked together to defeat Japan. At the time, after Mao came to power, one of the first things he wanted to do was establish diplomatic relations with the U.S. But he was rejected because he was a communist. And communists could not be trusted. The same happened, by the way, with Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh during World War II was working for the forerunner of the CIA. And he also wanted to establish diplomatic relations with the U.S. at the end of the war, but was rejected because he was a communist. And because they were both communists, and the evil communist empire was viewed, in my opinion, erroneously, as a threat to American capitalism, we wound up in Korea, we wound up in Vietnam, and the relationship with China became the forerunner of today's misunderstanding, to put it politely. Nixon, in his wisdom, felt that if America joined forces with China, they could defeat the Soviet Empire, and they did, as partners, working together. What I point out in the book, there was even a point in time where some in the American government wanted to nuke China after the Korean War. And that almost happened because of China's alliance with the so-called third world emerging countries and the U.S.'s support of Taiwan. Because Taiwan has been one of the main friction points between the U.S. and China. And it is a friction point that exists to this very day. And the recent election, speaking of elections in Taiwan, the Taiwanese, like the Americans who have voted so far, are very angry at the establishment or the leadership, the career politicians, the whatever you hear local candidates saying while they're running for office, the people of Taiwan are saying, the people of Hong Kong are saying, as you see in the Occupy movements, and many people in China are also saying. The point I'm trying to make in this book and why I'm calling it Custom-Made Revolution is because social media has changed the political landscape as we know it. We see it in the elections here today, and we see it in the elections everywhere. Parties as we know them, be they the Democratic Party here, the Republican Party here, or the Communist Party in China, are relics of the old century. The leaders of all those parties feel threatened because they can no longer misrepresent to the people that they represent what they are really doing. The people are no longer buying it, and it is a global issue. It is not just an American issue, which is why I am traveling to all the countries where elections are taking place to understand why. Now, China has, as I pointed out, ever since Mao came to power, tried to be a partner with America, not an enemy, notwithstanding what one hears during political campaigns in America. And the big boogie-boo that everyone mentions during elections is why China has basically become America's banker. All the factories are there. Why is everything manufactured there? It is very important to keep in mind that all the factories that make all the products that come here were built by foreigners, not by Chinese. Most of them American Fortune 500 companies, because labor was cheap. The fact is, labor costs in America became expensive. Capitalism being what it is, America being what it is, American factories were moved overseas. And the American jobs that were lost were taken up by others. That is important to keep in mind. China just didn't overnight take the jobs from Americans. American manufacturers brought their factories there because labor was cheap. As a matter of fact, the first union that Walmart was subjected to was a union in China. When Walmart opens its stores, first big stores there, within a couple of years, it could never unionize, or the workers in Walmart in America could never unionize Walmart, but they did so in China. And as a result, the knock-on effect here is Walmart is raising minimum wages, et cetera, So one has to really understand the underlying forces at work that create the false image of China being in conflict with America. We see what just happened at the climate change conference in Paris. Who are the two countries that led the charge for climate change and the new treaty? China and America. Xi Jinping and Obama. America and China can cooperate together. They can work together. The biggest threat to America when it comes to security is terrorism. Guess what? That's the biggest threat to China. They are working with America when it comes to terrorism because the biggest threat to China is Muslim terrorists. A lot of the Uyghurs from China's Xinjiang province go to fight with ISIS. So China feels more directly threatened by ISIS than does America. But no one talks in America about how America and China are cooperating to fight terrorism on a global scale, not just in the Middle East, because it is a threat to both countries. Both countries can work together because if you look at what it costs to sustain an empire, empires of the past can no longer survive. What brought about the demise of the British and French empires? The 1956 Suez Crisis, which I also talk about in the book. The Egyptians, Gamal Abdel Nasser, decided to seize the Suez Canal, which was built and owned by the French and the British. They decided to go invade Egypt and take over the Suez Canal. Who stopped them? The Americans. Eisenhower said, sorry, you can't do that. We can debate the reasons, oil, other interests. That brought an end to the British and French empires. They realized that there was another greater power that they had to listen to. But not only that, empires cannot be sustained financially unless the people support it. We see in America today all the voices that are opposed to any military engagement, be it in Afghanistan, Iraq, or any other place, through social media. Talking to university students, especially students here that are dealing with aerospace and the security and intelligence school, what is really in humanities and all of our collective interest is global security. When you look at aviation and space, and I have many friends who work at NASA, and I will share with you one story that relates to this in terms of how technology and what the students here are learning can be applied constructively for the future of humanity. A very good friend of mine was the pilot who flies the 747s that deliver pick up the space shuttle, take it to Edwards, fly it around when it was decommissioned. He retired from NASA, but still works there, is called in whenever they have to go way up there now at 40,000 feet above the infrared on scientific missions. Scientific missions with scientists from Europe that are trying to reconstruct I don't know what the correct scientific term is, but in effect the genome and DNA of space. And what were the molecules that brought about Earth? And so he, as a pilot flying them, and this was only a couple of years ago, decided to go talk to them when he had a break and his co-pilot took over the plane. I asked him, I said, so what are you doing up there? What are these scientists doing up there? He says, you're not going to believe it. We've got this big telescope. And so when I asked the scientists, I said, what are you looking for? They said, we're actually looking for this molecule. He says, I can't even remember the name of the molecule because they're reconstructing space and how space works and how we all fit in there. He said, I went back to the cockpit. I thought, wow, these guys, how do you find a molecule? He says, when the plane landed, all the scientists were jumping around. And the scientists, by the way, were from all the major European countries and a couple Asian countries. I don't know if there was anyone from China there because I didn't ask him. He said the scientists were all jumping up and down. He went up to them and asked them what happened. We found the molecule. They found it. They're reconstructing. So then when I was talking to Ace a little more, I said, so let me ask you something else, Ace. Have you seen UFOs? Do you believe in UFOs? He goes, officially, no. I said, don't give me this official line. Give me your personal opinion. He says, absolutely. I said, so he and I got into a big discussion, and other people were in the group with us. Shouldn't we as a humanity be focusing on how we survive together? And the movie Independence, of course, came up about people out there that we should be concerned about. And is that where our intelligence and security should be focused on, and we should all be working together as a humanity to survive? The reason I bring that up is because China now is the major force trying to get someone on the moon. They are finally in the space race. And just like we have the spaceship up there with the Russians that America's cooperating with in space, even though the US and Russia geopolitically are not in the same agreement mode, be it the Ukraine or be it Syria, when it comes to space, they are cooperating and working together. And China wants to get into the game and is getting into the game. So when it comes to China versus US relations, I think it is important that all of us, especially students here, when we look at how we develop technology and planes, should they be just for military purposes, or should they be for humanity? It's going back and looking at when the atomic bomb was being developed. All the scientists thought they were developing a bomb to end all wars. We know the truth. Anything but that happened. World War II, even though an atom bomb was needed to end the war with Japan, the wars didn't end, and nuclear war is still a threat. What are two of the biggest issues that are impacting the relationship between China and America today? The Spratly Islands, the Diaoyu Islands, North Korea. America says, China, rein in North Korea. China says, well, you want us to rein in North Korea? Why are you arming Taiwan? I mean, politics, there's got to be a quid pro quo. The Taiwanese even don't want American arms, and the legislature votes it down periodically. But America insists on the one hand on selling arms to Taiwan, and then asks China, who's objecting to the sales, to rein in North Korea. That's not going to work in politics. You want China to get active in the North Korean negotiations? They're happy to. The press talks about why the Chinese don't want to rein in the North Koreans because the American troops will come up north. There'll be refugees in China. There are many North Korean refugees there already. That is not the case. The Chinese leadership is very angry at North Korea and its behavior. And China is doing more business with South Korea, and the first Asian country Xi Jinping visited when he came to power was South Korea. What does that tell you about his relationship with North Korea? They're not happy. It's an easy resolution to address. and I have proposed one. There are basically 5 countries that are talking about how do you bring North Korea to heel. The South Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Americans, and even the Russians. It's very simple. America is a master at removing dictators, having them go into retirement with a lot of money. Whether it was Marcos in the Philippines, I can go through a list of Haitian dictators and others in Africa. The 5 countries sit down. Everybody wants peace in North Korea. You carve up North Korea into 5 economic zones, because the other issue is how do you pay for it? South Korea's already got an economic zone that's not fully functional. The Japanese would love to have one. The Chinese would love to have one. The Russians would love to have one. The Americans can help finance them. These are all countries that border there. The solution is there. It just has to be addressed forcefully, and there has to be real political will in America and China. Because without that political will, that conflict will continue. You look at the conflict in the South China Seas or the Diaoyu Islands. Diaoyu Islands, the Cairo Declaration, basically gave the islands to be held in trust by Japan, but declared they belong to China. In the Cairo Declaration, it was spelled out. The big problem that happened was China, when all these agreements were signed, was the Republic of China, ruled by Chiang Kai-shek, that all of a sudden became Communist China when Mao came in. So all of a sudden, a lot of things had to be reinterpreted. But the treaties speak for themselves. They're there. Japan, that bombed America, went to war with America, conquered and raped China, is now embraced by America, to the very anger and annoyance of China. And many Americans, by the way, because Japan, we know how they restrict American products into Japan. So what do they do? They come move their factories here, and all of a sudden a Honda and a Toyota that's built here is an American car. So politically, even in Asia, most of the Asian countries were invaded by Japan. Yes, they feel threatened by China, not militarily, economically, but they still feel threatened by Japan militarily, which is why everyone in Asia was opposed to Japan amending its constitution to allow it to now use military force for offensive purposes. Keep in mind, when Japan was defeated by America, a constitution was imposed on it that it could only use forces for defensive reasons and could not go abroad for any purpose, period. That just changed the last year. All of a sudden now, Japan, at the urging and encouragement of America, is allowed to become a military force to quote-unquote defend itself against China. That does not sit well with the Chinese. I don't think it sits well with a lot of Americans that understand what the conflicts are. So the relationship between China and America is one that both countries, in terms of the people, because I spend a lot of time with a lot of Chinese people, with a lot of Chinese people in government and leadership, and they feel very, very frustrated that they're still perceived as quote-unquote the commies. I mean, you look at some of the people that drive up to any of the Communist Party meetings, they're in their fancy cars, they're more capitalistic than many Americans. Or as I was first told when I started doing business in China, communism is just a chapter. It's 50 years at the time. We're a country of many centuries. Why are we still treated as communists? We are capitalists. We are business people. We were capitalists and business people before America existed. And there is no reason that business treaties and economic treaties and tax treaties cannot be signed by both parties. And the reality is that there are many business and political interests in America that see it in their interest to perpetuate a conflict or a misunderstanding with China. And I am hoping that now that America is back at its Cold War standoff with Putin and Russia, that American leadership will do what Nixon did, and if anything, get closer to China. Because the alternative is, if America wants to put a wedge between itself and China, it's going to push China back towards Russia, which has happened already in terms of some of the gas pipeline deals. How is that in we the maids, the Americans' interest? It's not. It is in America's interest to work with and be partners with China and together try and bring about a peaceful world, which China is trying to do. It wasn't until a few years ago that China even sent troops with the UN forces. Why is it doing that? Because it wants to, again, try and do what's right for humanity. So the issue of China and America are in a conflict. I think the conflict is overblown. The underlying strengths and desire by the people of each country to work there is there. And yes, I know all the issues, be it computer hacking, intelligence hacking, everybody does that. It's just that China gets a bad rap for that. America does it, Russia does it, every country does it. I remember the big scandal or brouhaha that Germany and Merkel raised when it was disclosed by Edward Snowden that the NSA was spying on Merkel. And then what happened a few weeks ago? It was disclosed that Merkel and the Germans were doing the exact same to the Europeans at the meetings there. America isn't doing anything everyone else isn't doing, and China and everyone else isn't doing anything America isn't doing. It's just that sometimes one country is better at it than another. And one country gets caught, and then the other country gets caught. But at the end of the day, everyone is playing the same game. And the new equalizer that no one is addressing is social media and the internet. It has brought people together. It has removed barriers, borders, communications. And intelligent people that believe in security have to embrace new technology, have to embrace what the people of their countries, the people they represent, be it the Chinese leadership of the Chinese people or American leadership of American people, which is peace, prosperity, education. Everybody wants the same thing. It doesn't matter whether they're Chinese or Americans. You see it in China today, you see it in America today. And it is up to the students of the world, including this world, to work together to try and bring about that peace and prosperity. And I believe that within the next 5 to 10 years, America and China will be global partners that will be working very close together and leading the world together to a more prosperous world by taking their respective strengths, attributes, relationships, because the people that America does not get along with are the people that China does, be it in the Middle East, be it in Africa. So if everyone on both sides, in terms of the leadership, combine their respective strengths and work together, all their proxies will come on board. The wars in the Middle East, the wars or conflicts in Asia can be ended very, very quickly if China and America sit down and come to terms. And I hope that the students of this university can play a major role in bringing that about. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Questions, come on down here. You hear everybody?
Can I ask two questions? Trans-Pacific Partnership, a secret trade deal. I'm worried about environmental and work condition type rules that are binding us. And the other question was, can we not construct an imaginary extraterrestrial that is benevolent, like in some movies, not hostile, like in Independence Day? So two totally separate questions, maybe. Thanks.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership, as you are probably aware, but for those who are not, is a partnership agreement initiated by America specifically to exclude China. China is not included in that partnership. Again, another example of China wanted to be part of that trade agreement and partnership, but America has deliberately excluded it. In terms of environment and climate change that it can bring about, if China is excluded, no one can blame China for any climate change issues. But China does want to be part of it. And China has actually, as a result, gone about creating alternative partnerships. Because the minute America is going to try and exclude China, China will go start launching its own initiatives, whether it's the New Silk Road initiatives across Asia, the Middle East and Europe, that also excludes America, Silk Road initiatives. There are so many initiatives. There's about 4 or 5 of them, not to mention the new Asia bank, infrastructure bank that China started to compete with the World Bank. An issue that I'd raised in another book of mine, volume 2 of this series, where I pointed out that when you have the World Bank and all the world organizations run by America, and China is only limited to 1 or 2% of say, it is only a matter of time before the Chinese will set up their own bank, especially if they're America's banker, which they are today. And if China really wanted to get nasty, it would do what most bankers do. They foreclose on their loans or mortgages. That would not be good for America. So the fact that it's not doing that is something to think about. In terms of outer space, yes, there is no reason that there cannot be a very peaceful and amicable and cooperative arrangement, but that is up to the students and Dr. Jones' school to arrange. Of course it can be. At least that's my opinion, and I reserve the right to be wrong, but I think it can be.
I just had a couple of quick questions. You described Islamic terrorism as the primary threat to both China and the United States, or that is the greatest threat. What were some of your criteria for deciding whether or not it was the greatest threat or the primary threat, only threat?
That's a very good question. There's a lot of criteria, and the basic fundamental criteria is the way the Quran is being translated or interpreted by the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, which is an extreme interpretation, but it is not extreme enough as far as Baghdadi is concerned and ISIS is concerned. He feels it has not been taken to the limit. And what one has to do is, again, study the history of the conflicts of Islam, because the Muhammad and Islam was one of the great empires. One I didn't address when I mentioned other empires. They basically conquered all of Asia, all of the Middle East, good parts of Asia, in terms of all the way India to Indonesia, Europe, Spain, there. And then upon the death of Muhammad, you had the conflict that created the conflict between the Shias and the Sunnis, a conflict that is still there and is the basis of what is going on in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, the conflict between Iran, Saudi Arabia. And the reason I think it is the most extreme is if you look at religious schisms in other religions, they are not as extreme or as violent as the Islamic ones are. Take Christianity. You have the Catholics, you have the Protestants, you have the Lutherans, you have different sects. Yes, the Catholics and the Protestants fought in Ireland recently, but that's about it. The rest of Christianity can live peacefully with each other. The same holds true for Judaism. You've got the conservatives, you've got the reformists. The same holds true for Buddhism. You take any other religion. So as long as a religion has any role in government, a message that America's founding fathers insisted America avoid, because religion is the root of all conflict, and they experienced it in Europe, and that's why when they wrote the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the word God does not appear one time in any one of those documents, and why they made a point of separating church from state. Islam has not separated church from state, and the Wahhabis, the extreme Sunnis, of which ISIS is, their extreme interpretation of the Quran, which includes the Sharia law, the beheadings, everything we've seen, and they've made it perfectly clear they don't intend to stop in the Middle East. They've declared it globally, whether it's to the Chinese with the, in Xinjiang, whether it's to America here. So it's not just something I'm saying, but it's something they are saying and something they are practicing, and and that's the basis for it.
And you mentioned Russia a little bit. I'm a little bit curious maybe to hear your thoughts, maybe after the fact, on where they're going to play in on this. And also, one of your responses to one of the questions kind of got me thinking a little bit, why China doesn't just call the mortgage, so to speak. Wouldn't that crash their economy as well as ours because we're so linked?
It would impact their economy, but it wouldn't crash it, because the difference between a totalitarian regime, which China is, the government there doesn't have to ask its people what it should do. It can just do it. Will it have a negative impact? Yes, but when you realize the amount of dollars that it has, both in cash and in treasuries, it doesn't have to unload too many trillions to create. I mean, America, if we're to be honest, from a technical financial point of view, is bankrupt. Okay? Any financial expert will tell you that. The only way America's surviving is the printing press is rolling and the dollars keep coming out. China can unload 1 or 2 trillion, whether it chooses that it be one of the 3 trillion it has in treasuries or one of the 3 trillion it has in dollars. All it has to unload is maybe, 10, 20, 30%, 40%, doesn't have to unload everything. So yes, it'll take a hit, but it'll survive a lot better than other countries that, especially America.
Do you think that'd be significant enough to stop them from ever doing that?
That I can't answer. I mean, my opinion is I can never put myself in the head of any political leader, because those are decisions made by political leaders that to me always seem to be irrational. So I don't know that that's the reason, but it may be.
Thank you very much. It was very enlightening. I appreciate it. This Eisenhower guy you mentioned that helped bring down the British and the French empires, he also, upon leaving office, had dire warnings for the growing emergence of the military-industrial complex, which I think all of us recognize as a huge economic power, and they're incentivized by these frictions that exist in the world. So how do we overcome that huge incentive to maintain friction, to embrace global peace and harmony?
You're right. Actually, his original term was Military-Industrial Congress, but he was forced to change it to complex. And as a general and a military man, he was very aware, and you're right, warned America about the need to restrain the military-industrial complex. And the fact is that that military-industrial complex is what drives a lot of the conflicts globally. And it is one of the key bodies that has to be restrained. I mean, and whoever is trying to restrain them runs up against that military-industrial Congress complex, whatever you want to call it, and it is a challenge. It is a challenge that Obama tried to address by cutting back their budgets, but if, as I heard just today, Ashton Carter wants to increase the military spending by $3 billion just to restrain Russia, give it to the European allies. So that is a debate that we the maids or we the people have to tackle head on, because that is one of the major problems or a contributing factor. Just by the way, on that subject of Eisenhower, he is the one who brought the word God back into the American currency and, all of a sudden into the public dialogue. And the reason is he wanted to show the godless communists, because as you all know, the communists don't believe in any God, why America, a God-fearing country, is going to defeat them. But until the 50s in Eisenhower, the word God, the Pledge of Allegiance, all that was nowhere to be seen. So It wasn't just that, but there was the other thing he brought on to overcompensate for it.
Well, as a retired Marine and retired from Lockheed Martin also, let's not inhibit the military-industrial complex too rapidly.
Oh, I agree, it's got, everything has to be paced.
Hello? Okay. I want to make a point before I ask my question. In 2007, Russia actually wanted to collect all the assets with China that the United States owed to Russia and China. But in good faith, China actually declined to do so with Russia because they knew that it would be an economic collapse globally. And so the United States government actually thanked China for acting in that good faith. My question is, I actually traveled to China for the summer during a language program, and I had the opportunity to stay with a couple of families. And we naturally got to talk about politics, which sometimes is a no-no in China, but I have a big interest in politics, and so I had to ask them, what is your perception of the United States? And the families that I stayed with, they said, the United States and all these negative things, they went into all these negative points. And they say that they're getting all this from the Chinese government, from Xi Jinping. So if the Chinese government really wants to do good work with the United States, why are they still pushing a negative perception of the United States? And why are they pushing programs to bring back Chinese interests into China instead of trying to globalize the Chinese people to the United States?
For the same reasons that the American leadership bashed China. As I pointed out earlier, when one country is attacking or bashing another country, then that country is going to respond in kind. One country is not just going to sit there and allow itself to be bashed without bashing back. And that is one of the fundamental issues. China, on the other hand, is trying to become more global, and if you look at just the number of students they send overseas, not just to America, but all over the world. But not just students. Look at all the money they're sending overseas to buy and invest and be part of, first and foremost, America. You look at the latest acquisition by a Chinese company, another American icon, Maytag. Okay, China is trying to invest as much as it can in the U.S. Unlike American companies, when they invest in China, they build factories to manufacture products for the U.S. But the minute the labor costs go up a little bit, they move the factories to Vietnam, Bangladesh, elsewhere, which is why China's feeling a recession. Unlike the Chinese, they buy and invest in America, and then they run that business here because they have an investment to protect. So the business approach that they both have is completely different. And the American bashing that happens in China is because of the China bashing that happens here. And again, that's the political leaderships on both sides. But there is no country Chinese admire more than America. Because if you look at the visa program that's known as the EB-5 of foreign investors that can come and invest in America and become citizens, the Chinese are the number one group that not only want to come to America, they want to invest in America and become American citizens or residents. It's the number one country or number one destination for Chinese. You ask any Chinese, what country do you want to go to if you had a choice to move to? And I don't know if you asked the people you stayed with that question, but if you did, I'd be surprised if they didn't say America.
They say that a lot of students really want to travel to the United States and they really want to get that American education. But what my host families say is that Xi Jinping, he creates all these programs because now he wants to bring back all those Chinese people and change the perception of what America is, and to change that perception to support China. And so that I find it really interesting how there's that different viewpoint of the people who live in China and the people who live here. And then I know you got some of that perception when you lived in China too. So I just thought that was...
No, it's a delicate balance.
One more thing. Do you think China is investing because of self-interest or because they actually want to globalize and to not necessarily help other countries, but to get involved with everything globally?
Both. Of course, it's out of self-interest. As a matter of fact, as a matter of policy, the government is encouraging state enterprises and individuals or private companies to go overseas, buy and invest as much as they can. So, but it is also for its own domestic interest and global interest, because at the end of the day, if you have a globalized world, you minimize conflicts. You have better understandings of each other. I mean, let's not forget that the history, I talked briefly about what happened as far as the way America accepted the Chinese approach, or Mao's approach, when he wanted to reconcile with America or make peace with America and become a partner with America. But let's not forget America's history towards Chinese. You know, whether it was the Chinese Exclusion Act or any of the ways that America treated Chinese when they were building the railroads and everything else. So there is a history of ingrained conflict or resentment that exists both because of the way Chinese were treated here historically and the way America rejected the Chinese government's approaches. And you have to balance that as contributing factors to the feelings Chinese have towards America, even though the majority of the feelings are positive, embracing, and want to be part of. But yeah, there's that resentment. I mean, you see that in America, whether you're dealing with African Americans, Latinos, there's always that racial issue because of the history that's going to take a couple more generations to get rid of, but it's there.
Thank you.
Try this one over here.
Coming from a student here that takes Chinese, in your opinion, do you think that if more American students were studying, say, Cantonese or Mandarin, that Americans would have a more positive outlook on China?
Absolutely. In my book, Custom Made Knowledge, I wrote that I think Chinese should be made a compulsory language study. I don't understand why French and Latin are still made mandatory classes in several universities. To me, I just don't get it. I mean, I would replace Latin and French with Mandarin overnight. So the answer is absolutely yes. That's how people get to understand each other better. Because one of the things the Chinese did a few years ago, it's about 10, 15 years ago, they decided they wanted the students in China to learn English. So they put out a call for English teachers. And they wanted it to be taught in all the universities, all the high schools, everywhere. And the call was for roughly, I mean, this is a number that I think is low, 1 million teachers that are English teachers. So when you meet certain Chinese students or people, as I do, you can tell where their English teachers came from because they speak English with either a Filipino accent, an Indian accent, an American accent, an English accent, because the English teachers came from everywhere. That was something China, as a government policy, imposed on all its schools. Why doesn't America do the same? Why is Latin more important than Chinese? I can understand Spanish. And that was another issue I raised In terms of engineering, that is a very important subject that America has neglected, as along with languages, math, sciences, and languages. You look at all the global competitions of high school students, university students, Americans usually wind up at the bottom of the list of those competitions. I mean, whether it's geography, history, math, science, the only area that America excels and beats everyone is engineering. But in all the other competitions, they're in the bottom of the list. They get beaten by everyone. I mean, it's embarrassing. It's not publicized here, but when you sit and see it over there, it is embarrassing.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your insights tonight. You speak disparagingly of politicians. They've worked very hard for your comments, I'm sure, and apparently have been successful. Politicians are the ones who create the problems. Politicians are the ones that have to solve the problems. How are we going to get over that?
Also a very good question. I'm going to answer that by raising another question and then answering it. Why did the Founding Fathers move the capital of the United States from New York to Philadelphia and then Washington, D.C.? The reason is not because it was the closest area Mason-Dixon line, and most of the answers I get when I raise the question. It was because Washington, D.C. was the swampiest, dirtiest, worst place to be. And the Founding Fathers felt that if any politician came there, they wouldn't want to come back. It was the way the government basically forced term limits. All right, and I wrote about this in my first book, Custom Made Spin. And you know what changed all that? And by the way, when that happened, you had part-time politicians, you had no taxation. What changed all that? Air conditioning. It's a fact. All of a sudden, air conditioning made Washington bearable. So people said, hey, how do we stay here? Well, let's create taxation. Well, so if you look again at history, which is why history is so important, the facts are that the Founding Fathers were brilliant in their ideas and what they thought. The problem is, it's that the politicians you're referring to are the ones that have created the problem. To answer your question as to how you solve it, you impose term limits where people go there, they do the job, then they go back to the real world and let people, and ideally have part-time politicians. One of many things I advocate in the book is, for example, we should go to a unicameral system. We don't need a Senate. The Founding Fathers didn't create a Senate. They created a Congress, President, and Supreme Court. Who created the Senate? The robber barons. You look at all the early senators and most of the senators there today, they represent moneyed interests. Most of the senators are millionaires or multimillionaires. But when the Senate was started, they were all the robber barons. They were appointed by the governors to basically override Congress. You look today, there's one state in America that is unicameral, Nebraska. It is the only state that has surplus budgets. It is the state that has given us Warren Buffett. Why do we need 2 layers of representative government? We don't. So if you eliminate half the career politicians, impose term limits, public financing, and another thing that has to be eliminated is the Electoral College. Here is America, the most democratic country in the world, that actually has one of the most undemocratic systems. Why can't it be the people vote direct for their elected representatives? Why does it have to go through an electoral college where most people here, I guarantee, and I'll take a bet, do not know who their electors are, who actually vote for you after you voted. Is that democracy?
Mentioned that in Arizona, we used to print our electors on the ballot, but the legislature just changed that.
Okay.
All right, you proposed that we divide up North Korea into 5 different economic zones, and if I understood correctly, that we would go on to impose like a Japan post-World War II type treaty on them. And I was wondering how, in the future, if that were to occur, I understand it would be a great exercise in international unity and everything, but how would we resolve the interests between 5 different parties after that, and figuring out how to get infrastructure built, and how to use the pre-existing and that sort of thing, how we resolve those sorts of issues between 5 different parties?
That's a good question. We have a model of Germany when East and West Germany reunited. It would still become one united Korea. But by creating the economic zones, the financial burden would be shared by the 5, 6 countries rather than just imposed on South Korea. And as long as the countries nearby have an economic interest, but it's still Korea, it's just one Korea with 5 economic zones that allows the different countries, for example, to set up their factories, low cost, etc., and to avoid a conflict between China and America, because China's worried that if they try and reunite the countries, the American forces are going to come and push all the North Koreans across the border. So it's again the political will. And in economic zones, whether they're set up in, you look at China's economic zones, you look at economic zones, let's say in Israel and Jordan, where the areas that you have economic zones, you have prosperity, and part of the infrastructure is then collectively developed that benefits everyone. Because and that was the big problem with East Germany and West Germany, it was the financial hit, but Germany could afford it. But it's still paying the price in many, many ways. So my answer is that it's all a matter of how it's managed smartly, but it's doable.
Would you foresee anything like what happened in East and West Germany between the Russians and the United States becoming embroiled in that sort of conflict? Instead, you have 5 different powers now?
No, because the reason East and West Germany united was after the Soviet Union collapsed. It was the conflict between Russia and America that kept an East and West Germany separate, just like the concern today between China and America is keeping a North and South Korea apart. But if they work together, it can be solved. The minute the Soviet Union collapsed, that's when the wall came down, because then Germany just took the initiative and did it. Whereas South Korea is faced with, Kim Jong-il there, who is not exactly very cooperative. So the way to remove him is either financially, but if he doesn't take the financial option, if the Chinese and Americans are working together, he's going to be removed in other ways.
Thank you.
Last question.
Some American observers, such as, if I remember correctly, Peter Chang, believe that there's quite a few coming major crises in China. I'd like to please comment on the 3 crises which are often said to be coming to China. 1, that their stock market is overvalued, hence the recent crash. 2, that their real estate market is in just as bad, if not worse, a bubble than ours was. And 3, that masses of unemployed People's Liberation Army officers are a threat of insurrection, particularly since their organizational military skills can be used to mobilize peasants who are being thrown off their land by corrupt bureaucrats in tandem with corrupt businessmen taking peasants off the farmland that they've farmed for thousands of years and replacing it with new buildings, for example. And that there are, in fact, riots and insurrections happening all over rural China that we simply don't hear about much because of the state-controlled media. Could you please comment on these three allegations?
Happy to. There are over roughly 1,000 riots or insurrections a day in China. A day across the country that are not reported here. And they are usually peasants, farmers, villagers whose land is being basically confiscated from them for developers. And when the peasants or farmers or villagers go to complain, all of which, by the way, I do mention in this book as well, they get put in prison or worse. In terms of the military people being laid off, it's not just that, it's actually worse than that, is the military or the People's Liberation Army has been engaged in a lot of businesses in all sectors. And part of Xi Jinping's crackdown is to get them out of business and to focus on the military, because part of China's problem, which I also mentioned that may be of interest to students studying security and intelligence, the Chinese military structure is a very corrupt structure. And a lot of officers get promoted based on the size of bribe they pay, something that Xi Jinping is trying to bring to an end as well. Because you cannot have a true fighting force if the officers that control the troops and rank and file are there because of the bribe they paid rather than their military skills. One of the reasons that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party are cracking down and are objecting and concerned about what is going on in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is a very, very vibrant democracy with over 14 parties. And as you all saw a couple years ago, the Occupy movement there basically brought the city to a standstill for 79 days. And the main complaint was, it was basically anti-Hong Kong government being the puppet of Beijing. So it was as much of a threat to Xi Jinping because a lot of the people in China saw that, especially all the tourists coming there, and social media again, the China firewall cannot fight all social media. So there is grave concerns at the highest levels of leadership in China that things may be getting out of control. Because I haven't seen the latest tweets after the recent Taiwan election, but after the last Taiwan election 4 years ago, that I also mentioned in the book, a lot of people in China saw the democratic movement there as something they wanted to see come to China. And the same thing is what a lot of mainland Chinese people want to see today. When they see Chinese in Hong Kong exercising and practicing democracy, they see it in Taiwan. Their question is, why not here? So the Chinese leadership is threatened. As far as the economy, the housing, one of the things that, and I'll start with the housing and then go to the stock market. I remember there was a CBS program a couple of years ago about all the vacant apartment buildings in towns being built in China and why this is going to bring an economic collapse. If you go look at those same villages and towns today that were in that CBS program, they're all full and very active and buzzing. And the reason is, one has to understand how real estate is developed in China. You make your down payment on a building that isn't even built. The buildings get built. The towns get built. The building or the units are then handed over to the tenants, who then have to decorate, because they basically get raw buildings. So by the time the buildings are decorated, designed, the people move in, same with the stores, there's a period where they look like ghost towns. But the fact is, they eventually get fully occupied. It's just the way buildings are done there is a lot different than here. Is there a lot of buildings notwithstanding that in certain sectors? Yes. But it's because, again, of corruption. And it's primarily in the commercial sector rather than the residential. The stock market, yes, there are problems in the stock market, and yes, there are problems in the economy because a lot of factories are moving out of China to Vietnam and other places. But what has happened is the Chinese economy now, rather than being export-oriented, is being consumer-driven to try and get the Chinese to start spending their money. And rather than have the Chinese economy supported by foreign buyers, have it supported by local consumers. Are there problems in China? Yes. Just like there are problems everywhere at all levels. And the criticisms of Chang are valid ones. There have been many who have written about some of the concerns, myself included in this book as well. And by the way, the book is for free for anyone who wants one. But all we ask is that if you want to make a donation to the Prescott Police Foundation, please do so.
Thank you. Thanks.